Okay, so I see slide number 1, slide number 2. Okay, there we go. Just a brief background. The role of the transmission authority is to monitor the adequacy of the transmission system. The authority actually does have authority to bond for either purchase or build of transmission, if that's what it takes to meet the interests of North Dakota. It's kind of a authority of last resort, however. Next slide, please. For those of you that are not familiar with the power pools, most of the power in the United States is within independent system operators or power pools. In North Dakota here, as you can see, we're kind of Swiss cheese between the Southwest Power Pool, which the Basin Electric and the dams, Bureau of Reclamation, that is all part of Southwest Power Pool. Most of the rest of the utilities in the state are part of the Midwest Independent System Operators. So that does present some challenges for North Dakota, but it's the reality that we live with. Next slide, please. Okay, the grid is very complex and ties together in many places, but as you can see from this general depiction, for the most part, the grid is designed to deliver power to the east. Most of that is within the Midwest Independent System Operator, MISO. Some of the power that goes out of the state also does go out on the SPP portion of the system. And that primarily goes more to the south and the southwest. Next slide, please. But the grid is full. You know, so different people talk about solving problems by generating more electricity. Well, if you're planning to get it out of North Dakota, you're out of luck, because the grid is full. There are only limited things you can do to increase the capacity of the grid, and they all involve money and lots of it. Next slide, please. The market price is one way we can tell that the grid is full. This is a node down by Ellendale where electricity is bought primarily from the wind generation down there. We had a new line that was built from Ellendale to eastern South Dakota called Big Stone South, and we were optimistic that that was going to serve the Ellendale area. It ends up, you can see what has happened to the pricing since that line was put in service, and it's now down to about $10 a megawatt hour on the average. And if that's the average, you know that the short-term pricing oftentimes drops below that. To put that in perspective, most of the plants that you would find around North Dakota comfortably operate in the $20 a megawatt hour or more range. The typical wind contract is $20 a megawatt hour is kind of the round number. So if you as a utility entered into an agreement to pay $20 a megawatt hour for wind off of a project down in the Ellendale area, you're currently getting about $10 a megawatt hour instead, but you're paying the developer the $20 megawatt hour that you agreed to. So the bottom line is that difference in market pricing is actually reflected back to the consumer. It's not something that is picked up by the developer in most cases. So a lot of people think maybe it's tough times for the developer. I say it's more often tough times for the consumer. And by comparison, if you were to build a new natural gas combined cycle power plant, we'll see a slide later that says you would need a market about 4 times that much to be able to justify building a new combined cycle gas plant in that area. Next slide, please. This is a study that was done, completed early this year. Basically, just the bottom line again is the grid is full. If we continue at the rates we are, it's going to be way over capacity within a few years. Next slide, please. Another way of determining the health of the grid is the volatility, and the gold bars here are the more recent years, and the other bars are the previous 3 years. So you can see that the price is becoming much more volatile in recent years, and that is also a indication that there's more people wanting to put electrons on the grid than the grid is capable of handling. Next slide, please. We also had a number of projects, primarily wind generation projects, that wanted to be added to the grid. The last round of evaluations for the cost of adding those to the grid resulted in some very high costs. In many cases, the cost of attaching to the grid was similar to the total cost of the project itself. So it virtually doubled the price, and most of those projects decided to cancel rather than to pay that high price. Next slide, please. But North Dakota is a very attractive place for developers to want to build wind generation, as this slide indicates. Best average capacity factor by state in this region. And so we can be comfortable that once we have enough transmission capacity, the developers will want to come back to North Dakota. They will want to get in on the better return on investment you get when you invest in a place where you can get a high capacity factor due to the consistent wind. Next slide, please. Switching gears a little bit here and talking about MISO. MISO is, they're beginning to realize that the changes in the makeup of generation on the grid is creating some future challenges. They've done an evaluation here that they depict by the complexity of the grid. Old sources of generation with rotating mass and things like our coal plants, our gas plants, our hydro plants, they have what we call grid attributes. New types of generation that are operating through inverters like a wind farm, they don't bring those same attributes to the grid. So this is showing that as we increase the amount of renewable energy on the grid, we're going to have to go to great measures to replace those attributes through various means. And as that grid complexity goes up, there will be a cost associated with it. That's the piece of the picture that hasn't become real clear and apparent at this point in time. Next slide, please. In this particular illustration from MISO, they're showing that the arrows on the left are showing which way those baseload resources, reserve margins, and price have been going. And then at the bottom, some of the more uncertain things of the grid that are going up. And the bottom line is that the arrows are pretty much going the wrong direction to keep the availability, the flexibility, and the visibility of the grid. So there is a lot of attention being paid to that. People are optimistic that there are technologies to be able to overcome that, but it's certainly not going to be the kind of grid we've been used to having in the past. Next slide, please. Just want to point out on this slide, the blue you see in the middle, or the gray, depending on the price of gas versus price of coal, shows that MISO is still expecting to have those resources available as we go forward to higher renewables. However, I want to point out that a business plan is difficult to conceive of if you've got a plant that is just operating those few hours out of a year, and yet is so important when we are reaching those peak demands. Next slide, please. This is information. I had done some of this work using my own numbers, and I found some information that others have worked on, which basically made my numbers look pretty good. But if you look at the left-hand side, the dotted line is kind of the break-even point. And you look at the evaluation they've done, there's very few cases where the dots fall above the dotted line, which is an indication that it is a financially good decision to build that kind of generation. The one on the right shows that solar is the most attractive, but that's actually highly subsidized. The chart on the right is broken into two parts, and we're not going to dwell on much of that except to point out that the upper part is all generation that is controllable. You can dispatch it at the rate you want. Then you get down into the last four, the non-dispatchable on and offshore wind, solar, and some hydroelectric. The fact that the pricing on the wind onshore and the pricing on combined cycle natural gas, which is a dispatchable technology, those two are about the same. And right now, there really is no benefit, so to speak, to investing in the dispatchable when the wind, onshore wind, is competitive because of its subsidization. Next slide, please. So transmission options, since that's my part of the business, the Coal Creek situation is kind of the elephant in the room at this point in time. And so let me address that first. I have been in touch with entities that are very interested in buying the plant and the transmission line, and fully expect that there will be offers tendered in the reasonably near future with that thought in mind. And in addition to conventional operation, they are going to be considering new technology options such as CO2 capture, and they're looking at electric storage. They're looking at integration with renewables. So the point being is they're interested in the full project with the idea that they would have a variety of electric products, so to speak, to send down the line. If they are successful, there will be additional investment made, estimates up to $2 billion worth of additional things that could be added to accomplish that variety of products on the line. There are also entities that are interested in the line, and some of them would reserve it for themselves and use it for wind generation only. In North Dakota, we like to promote our all of the above, so we're certainly rooting for a solution that includes a variety of options. There are also private line, or you could call them merchant line options that could be done in a similar manner and perhaps built with support from entities that are willing to pay the price, so to speak. It could be a wind development company. It could be utility interested in wind generation. It could be a utility or a separate transmission company that's interested in getting power out of North Dakota and into the market, one of the places where it's needed. So there's some active discussions going on there. And then, of course, there's the standard MISO grid planning. But the biggest problem there is getting agreement on who's going to pay. It's referred to cost allocation in the business, and cost allocation is a tricky thing. The last time a large project was undertaken with several lines with MISO, there was what they called multi-value projects. And so basically everybody in the region paid for those projects because everybody was assessed as having seen some benefit from that. That's not a popular topic going forward, so there's work going on trying to find a different approach. Next slide, please. This is also a map that's come out recently from MISO showing where they are expecting demand to be to build new transmission. And as you can see, North Dakota is one of the reddest areas on the map. And that certainly reflects the fact that it's a very good place to do business if you're in wind generation. So therefore, we are going to need more transmission to carry that to load. The dotted lines you see there are indication that they're looking at options which would include high voltage transmission lines similar to the line from Coal Creek to the cities or similar to the one from Center to Duluth. Additional lines of that nature would be very efficient to carry that power out of North Dakota. But again, we need a plan on how we're going to pay for those. Next slide, please. So what can North Dakota do? We have a reputation for being business friendly, and keeping that reputation going is certainly important. And remember the high capacity factor we have, so we can feel like we're on the winning side relative to that. But we also want to keep in mind that if we allow our current generating sources to be shut down prematurely, they will likely never return in kind or never return as a similar size of generation of a gas combined cycle plant, for example. One of the other areas, especially thinking the western part of the state, there has been interest in building lines to the west and tying in, for instance, down where the coal strip plant has been at. Some of the retirements there have opened up transmission options. We're keeping our eyes on those opportunities. Have nothing really active at this point in time. So this is my last slide, and I'll defer to you, Jeff, on those additional slides I borrowed from Mike Nassie's presentation. Should we take time for those, or should we just leave those for the membership to look at on their own?
Can you hear me all?
I can hear you now, Jeff.
Okay. I think what I'd like to tell everyone online. We're getting an echo here. Hang on a second.
There we go.
Everyone, if you're interested in what we were talking about there, Mike Nassie, who actually resides in Texas, gave an excellent presentation to the legislature's Energy Development and Transmission Committee on Tuesday morning. For what we're talking about, I would highly recommend it to anybody interested in happenings in coal country or wind country for that matter, because he spent a great deal of time talking about the situation that's been going on in California and its over-reliance on renewable energy. And he talked a little bit about the distortion that subsidies have created in the electric markets as well. You will find that in that video is recorded on the legislature's website, and Mike Nassie's presentation begins at 9:45 in the morning. So if you're curious about that at all, it was an excellent presentation. I'd just refer you to that. And do we have any questions for John? I do not see any questions for you, John. So I think we'll thank you and appreciate your joining us today.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yep.